ESG has traditionally, and climate often is still talked about as a risk and as a challenge, which it is. But there's another component to it, which is the opportunity that Lisa also just mentioned, right? And how companies can actually leverage that to access capital, to differentiate themselves in the talent market and attract talent that cares about sustainability more broadly, or even differentiate themselves from a product perspective.
Hello and welcome to the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast, where we interview business leaders and emerging market experts on business innovations, market opportunities, and macro-level trends in emerging and frontier market countries. Join us for the next hour to dive deep into the world of emerging markets as we speak with top performers who are successfully investing, working, and living in these markets themselves.
Hello and welcome to this new episode of INSEAD Emerging Market Podcast. I am Vincent Tordeau and I will be your host today. Today, we will discuss sustainable business opportunities in Southeast Asia. And to discuss this topic, I'm pleased to welcome Lisa Genasci and Marc Sch. Lisa is a Managing Director of Sustainable Finance with ADM Capital, where she leads the firm's ESG Committee and sits on the Investment Advisory Committee. Marc is a Managing Director and Partner at BCG and is the Southeast Asia Lead for Social Impact, Environment and Climate. Lisa, Marc, thank you very much for joining us. In business, sustainability refers to doing business without negatively impacting the environment, community, or society as a whole. Sustainability in business generally addresses two main categories: the effect business has on the environment, the effect business has on society. The goal of a sustainable business strategy is to make a positive impact on at least one of those areas. Building sustainable business is particularly critical in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is one of the world's most vulnerable regions to climate change. The region has about 700 million people and an economy topping $3 trillion. It also covers a wide range of economic and human development. Unless climate change is checked, the Asian Development Bank estimates the region's economy could shrink by 11% by the end of the century due to the toll on agriculture, fisheries, and tourism. And so to start our conversation, I would like to ask Marc and Lisa to share their thoughts on sustainable business opportunities in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, happy to. So I think if we look at Southeast Asia, I would say it's a microcosm, as often so much talked about, because of the diversity of the different countries that we have in Southeast Asia in terms of economic development, political systems, but also the fabric of the economies within each of the countries, right? And so if we look at, just take a climate perspective, as you kind of alluded to earlier, and maybe take GHG emissions as one way of characterizing different economies, what we see is obviously energy generation accounts for a large portion of those, often through coal-fired power, but that's often a sort of a more state-controlled sector. So it's, if you think about businesses, it's probably more instructive to look sort of one level down and to the second, third, and fourth contributors, right? And there we quickly get to actually agriculture and Southeast Asia producing a lot of crops that are, both used within Southeast Asia, but also globally. And as an economic factor, we get to transport, logistics, we get to all of the more heavy emitting industries around building materials, cement, mining, metals, and so forth, that are actually obviously also fueling the infrastructure sector as well as the private sector that are responsible and ultimately accountable and take action in this space.
Thank you. Lisa, your perspective?
Yeah. Thanks, Vincent. Well, Marc has obviously provided a very good sort of broad sweep across sustainability in Southeast Asia. But I would just add to this that sustainability really isn't an option, doesn't really matter. Sustainability is just a factor that needs to be built into every business opportunity. Just pause for a second and refer to the criticisms of ESG and sustainability that we've seen most recently in the press. I would say that still building risk assessments, shifting business strategies, regardless of the sector, to mitigate or adapt to climate is just not an option. So most businesses understand this. It's not an option. Any business that's not seeing the sort of wholesale transformation of every industry and economy that we're facing is simply not managing risk adequately or looking at the opportunities that we face, because obviously with transformation also comes opportunity. In terms of agriculture and land use sectors, which is where at ADM we're looking very closely to help stimulate new business models that incorporate sustainability, we're seeing lots of opportunities. And businesses, again, that aren't seeing this are missing out, not to mention that they're not managing risk adequately. About 40% of land globally is used to produce food. Southeast Asia is no exception. And I think about the same percentage of population is engaged in agriculture. So you can see the crossovers between both the sort of the climate risk and the sort of the people aspect of agriculture. About 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions are from agriculture when land use is taken into account. In 24 countries, I think agriculture is the primary source of emissions. And in Indonesia, that number is 60%. So 60% of Indonesia's greenhouse gas emissions come from land use change from forest to agriculture, the burning. So also in Indonesia, important to remember that 13% of GDP is agriculture. So a country like Indonesia that relies on agricultural commodities in particular, a country of 17,000 islands that is vulnerable to climate change, to extreme weather, heat, sea level rise, drought, recognizes acutely the importance of building sustainability into business models, considering energy sources, phasing out coal, producing more food with less, conserving water, reducing agriculture inputs, for example, and then also considering how people receive capital, how rural sector can feed itself, can accommodate, can adapt to climate at the same time. So most industries will be affected and need...
And governance. Thank you. And to follow up on your initial comments, how can the different dimensions of sustainability...
The company is run, management practices, the board level structure, how the board interacts with the company, for example. Social aspects consider how the company treats its workers, if it's inclusive or not in terms of diversity, but also how it engages with those involved in the business, with communities where they do business, and of course the environmental considers the environmental context, which would vary by sector. And the agriculture sector, is there deforestation, supply chain, how are peat lands treated and protected? Are there protected areas to manage as part of a business proposition? Is there pollution from production, water, air, soil? What are the energy sources? What are the inputs used? So they are all interrelated and equally important. You can't think about, as I've mentioned earlier, the sort of the land use sector, be able to plant. So are they integrated with the banking system? Do they have access to lending? So it's must treat all equally.
Thank you. Marc, your perspective on the different dimension of sustainability specifically in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with Lisa, and probably, they're generally quite interrelated, but much more so, I think, in this context that we operate here. And actually, my experience, talking to corporates, is they very much recognize their responsibility across each of these dimensions, and climate just added another component to it, but, it's not, they don't see that as separate, basically, to the broader sort of ESG agenda that they're running. The other thing I just wanted to add, picking up on something that Lisa was saying just now, is ESG has traditionally, and climate often is still talked about as a risk and as a challenge, which it is, but there's another component to it, which is the opportunity that Lisa also just mentioned, right? And how companies can actually leverage that to access capital, to differentiate themselves in the talent market, and attract talent that is, that cares about sustainability more broadly, or even, differentiate themselves from a product perspective, depending on, obviously what industry we're talking.
Thank you. What are some of the challenges sustainable businesses will face in a post-pandemic world? The specific challenges facing those initiatives in Southeast Asia you're seeing, Marc?
Yeah, I think in general, obviously, this is a space, I would say, where there's a lot of uncertainty because it's not necessarily clear, where will the opportunities rise? How will consumers, for example, How much will their value products? And so what does that mean, from a positioning perspective? What are companies that will finance some of these sustainability initiatives? How will they look at these companies, right? Because some of them obviously come with a legacy, if I can call it that way, of being maybe in high emitting industry, but want to change, right? So they are also trying to understand, access and how this will evolve. And, if I just look at sort of green financing frameworks, there's a lot of evolution, I guess, over the last, years and months on this as well. So there's a bit of ambiguity, I guess, and uncertainty in this. But at the same time, I guess, if you really think through those scenarios, and I think that's the way corporates need to think about it, they can put initiatives in place that will help them sort of thrive in different environments.
I think there is a kind of a very specific political. And as a quick follow-up on the headwind sustainable businesses could be facing in the region, what are your views on the political risk? Marc?
I guess it probably adds more broadly to some of these uncertainties. So both, I think, the broader geopolitical or regional geopolitical developments, Southeast Asia, China, US, as well as sort of the domestic, I guess, political developments with, quite a few elections sort of coming up over the next 1 or 2 years as well. So that probably gives uncertainty to the regulatory environment or to the political dimension. But that said, I think most companies are coming around to that we can't wait and see what happens, but basically need to start to position ourselves and take action, right? But maybe take some flexibility, as moving forward.
Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, I agree with Marc. I think the path is broadly charted. It's the inevitability is there. It's just how do we get there? From my perspective, the main challenge as I see it, or one of the main, there are multiple challenges. It's going to be an extremely complex transition, but one of them is, and a fundamental one that we've bumped up against, is the additional cost of sustainable production, something that Marc alluded to. So who's going to pay for that? Is it going to be the consumer, for example? Is it going to be the MNC accepting that profits are reduced? It's not actually additional cost in the end, it's the real cost of production, right? We're used to cheap clothes that don't integrate externalities, water pollution, soil pollution, air pollution, haze from burning, and other pollution. All of those are externalities that have not been included in the cost of production, and all have public health consequences, all deplete our resources, and all are untenable looking forward. But the transition to integrating those costs into production is going to be a tough one. But I do see that the dramatic 2 years of COVID lockdown, where we've completely changed our lives, and we've seen that we can just alter how we live, has also changed people's perception of what can be done in a positive way. So there's more attention being paid perhaps to appreciating nature, for example, and that has positive consequences perhaps for how we produce our goods, just the appreciation of what is around us and our environment broadly. And that we can transition. So I do hope that leads into a greater understanding of the complexities in a place like Southeast Asia, which is producing the world's commodities, and a lot of and is manufacturing some of its goods too. Of course, governments need to pay more attention than they are at the moment to regulation, build a significant carbon tax to really stimulate that change. But, businesses are largely paying attention, and finance certainly is, to sustainability, and considering the regulatory, legal, reputational risk of not doing so. I mean, there's both the sort of the opportunity that we've outlined, and also the stick of the sort of impending regulatory, legal, and reputational risk if they don't transition or pay attention to sustainability. So the risk is really about, again, the transition, which is, how do we lead that transition in industries? Some industries will be completely eliminated because they just can't make that transition, and there are going to be consequences for people. So, and again, referring back to the agricultural commodities, one that has been heavily hit by sort of reputational issues is, of course, the palm oil sector. But that is complex. It's a significant portion of GDP in a place like Indonesia, and it is an employer of people. 4 million smallholders produce palm oil in Indonesia. It's 40% of all palm oil production is produced by smallholders. So we need to not eliminate palm oil, as I think a lot of people would have it, but we need to just transition how it's produced and make sure that it's not produced associated with deforestation. So those challenges just need to be confronted and dealt with and transitioned, rather than, there be sort of a full stop to.
I think, if we look across the region, and compare it maybe to other regions, and on pricing those externalities, I think, they're still not priced in at the moment, in most markets here. Now, obviously, the regulator can play a role in doing so, and there's been announcements around that. For example, also in Indonesia, with the carbon tax being announced and launched. The question is obviously, what's the real price of these externalities, and how do we actually get to the right price signals, right? So, and I think there's where we're seeing some positive developments around, for example, establishing of carbon trading market platforms that are ultimately building the infrastructure for us to do that going forward. I think the question is, I guess, how can both, I think, the regulator, the government, but also the corporates through their actions and their initiative accelerate the pricing of these externalities, right? And in some ways, for me, it's also about who's willing to lead here. Often individual companies may find it difficult to necessarily stick their head out, but it's then a question around, I think, building sort of coalitions across private sector companies, maybe some state-owned sector companies, as well as with parts of the regulator to actually drive that forward. So that's sort of how I would describe probably a model that could help accelerate from where we are today to somewhere where we need to be quite quickly with the next 5-10 years, the latest.
Yeah, those coalitions are often very scary for businesses, but it's absolutely, you're 100% right. That's the way forward. We need to think differently about how partnerships are formed in order to be able to create these new business models, because they are going to be public and private and communities and conservation. that all of that needs to be somehow integrated into the business models that we look forward that we look forward to see in the future. And I think, and governments need to understand that also and be comfortable associating with the private sector and providing the incentives that are going to be necessary in order to stimulate that change. They need to cut through the political challenges, I would say, and the local interests, and focus on that transition with things like, a better price for renewables, stop subsidizing petroleum except for those who need it, substantial tax on carbon. The $2 on carbon, tax on carbon in Indonesia is just not sufficient. We need a much higher tax on carbon. I think an article in Nature last week said that the real cost of carbon should be $185. Regulate coal, make sure the EV transition includes a complete supply chain reframe. So from the nickel production to the smelting to the battery production and recycling. Again, it's like, we have to think about the whole supply chain. It's not just, just one small business opportunity anymore. And that will involve, again, those coalitions and those partnerships if we're going to transition supply chains. Broadly, we need to do a better job with waste. That's often the purview of government. Recycling needs to be encouraged. Environmental regulation needs to be tightened and enforced. China has obviously managed better in terms of enforcement in recent years, just because they had to. They recognized that there was going to be mass social uprising if they didn't clean up the air and the water and the soil. So those regulations that have been on the books for years were enforced or are starting to be over the last years have been enforced and fines have been issued for violations. That's what needs to happen across Southeast Asia also. It's just a matter of time.
One tool public authorities have to drive this change is through the funding route. Given the tightening financial conditions in the region, how do you expect this to affect funding availability?
Yeah, there's a lot of I guess there's a misperception of risk is what I would say still in the sector. There's a sense that finance hasn't necessarily transitioned to that new view of partnerships that we've mentioned is going to be so important. And the sense of integrating many players into a transaction, which is just going to have to be part of any sort of investment story. And then there's concern about, what does it mean to have communities as part of a transaction or conservation? Who's going to manage that? And what is the reputational risk? So there's still a real reluctance to step into difficult sectors with finance in new ways. But of course, that doesn't hold true for renewables. There just hasn't been the government incentive to provide the right pricing around renewables to incentivize the private sector to step in or investors to step in and finance in that sector. So, I think, again, it sort of varies depending on the sector, what the challenges are, but there is this misperception of risk and people still are reluctant to invest differently. They're still thinking about how they invested in the past. But from my perspective, that is the reputational risk, is investing in a company in palm oil production in the way that it had been, invested, the way investors had sort of approached palm oil, in the previous years. That's not the right approach looking forward. So we need to change that. But again, it's.
Yeah. I just want to maybe pick up on one point around, Lisa, you said it takes time. So I think all of these are transitional discussions, right? So how do we transition, right? One of the, key words over the last sort of year or two has been this question of just transition, right? Because, and that's where government particularly, needs to play a role, because, as we said, all of these sectors that we just talked about, in agriculture more broadly, but palm or pulp and paper, or in mining, obviously there's the coal mining component, but there's also other metals. All of this, or cement, for example, as a high emitting industry, there's typically, as you say, there's a reputational risk in sort of engaging with these sectors, but we cannot actually do the transition if we don't engage with these sectors. And so I think there's institutions, governmental or not, that can play a role at helping ensure that, the transition is just and true, sustainable, ultimately, right? And that corporates are also held to account, to improving across all of these ESG dimensions as they go through the transition. So I think that's I think one role, and I think the other one is obviously there's probably some more systemic risks involved in funding, where I think government institutions or sovereign wealth funds or sort of other sort of indirect public institutions can also take a role and play a facilitating role as well by, for example, co-investing or the like, right? So I think for me, that's where I see sort of the role, but it's really important that we don't shy away of tackling these sometimes shunned industries, because if we don't address them, we're actually not addressing the problem, and we're just pushing it out, right? Which ultimately I think will not just make it more difficult for the planet, but more difficult for the economies, these companies, and with that, I think for the people that are associated with them, for employment, and then we'll have a totally different set of problems to deal with at that point in time.
Thank you. So far, we have been discussing the role of public authorities as well as companies. I will be interested to hear your view on the roles individuals as consumers, workers, or entrepreneurs can play in driving this change. Marc, if you would like to lead.
I think sort of consumer, obviously, and I think the general the voter and the individual as such, in a more broader sense, obviously plays a vital role, I think, in the transition. I was part of actually just pre-COVID, part of a sort of discussion panel, and there was a question to the audience around, who do they believe will be able to lead into the climate action, right? And of the three potential components of it, which was individual, corporates, and governments, the individuals and the corporates were the ones that people would most bet on actually driving, action going forward. Now, to your point, are they actually in a position, I think, across Southeast Asia to do so? I think there's two components to me of that. One is sort of the, I guess, awareness side. So are they aware around the climate challenges more broadly, or environmental challenges more broadly? But also, are they then aware how that trickles down into, their purchasing decisions that they make every day when they go into the supermarket or the like. And actually, so we did a study recently in Indonesia, and it was geared towards the 18 to 30-year-olds. And we actually found that, over 30% were willing to pay a premium, a small premium, maybe 10%, but generally willing to pay a premium for more sustainable products. So there was awareness, there was a general willingness there, right? And this is not just like an affluent part of the population, but across the board. But that said, also when you ask people to then rank, how important is this, and this actually coincides with some of the UNDP studies I've seen, then it comes out at like number 4, number 5, because employment, food, obviously still dominates sort of like the priorities ultimately, right? So I think, I'm I guess cautiously optimistic in that sense, because you see the awareness, you see the willingness, but obviously we actually need to fix and help economic development more broadly, that this then also translates or is able to translate into action and to people actually paying more of a premium. Now, if they have the choice between the same product, one more sustainable and the other, and they come at the same price, then actually they will choose the sustainable product, right? So that's already obviously a good thing to start off with.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up Marc's perspective, which I think is quite an interesting one. I mean, obviously, when we're talking about consumers being ready, and we're talking about leading the transition, it's in large part, it's the global consumers that are going to help lead this transition, right? Because they are buying products that are produced in Indonesia. They're buying the agricultural commodities. They're buying manufactured products. They're buying commodities that are produced in a place like all over Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, and they have to understand, sustainability and what it means to pay that really low price for a product that's produced without factoring externalities. But then sort of switching into the Southeast Asia consumer, I think perhaps because the Southeast Asia consumer does live with typhoons, extreme weather events, extreme heat, they're connected to the sort of the blunt end of the stick from climate. They're already seeing it. They're seeing that transformation. So I think that they are more switched on to what that means, sustainability, what that means. And I agree with Marc. I think that is a factor in their decision making. And then you have, of course, that's more the urban population. The rural population doesn't have the ability as often to make the sort of decisions about, higher price or not, because they're still trying to feed their family. So the financial inclusion is so important. And lack of financial inclusion of the rural sector is such a big issue, and certainly one that we've been looking at. So bringing rural farmers into the banking system, digitizing them. So bringing also all of the sort of digitization and the sort of the techno savvy that you have from the urban populations in Southeast Asia into the rural sectors, I think is also really important in terms of building in the understanding of climate, what's happening in the sort of rural economies. That's a critical piece of the puzzle and key to stemming deforestation and dealing with the climate issues that we face globally. So again, it's sort of all interrelated, but I think certainly the urban Southeast Asian consumer is very aware and understanding, and the rural communities feel the transition that they're, in their weather, they're farmers, but don't necessarily have the ability to make those sorts of decisions.
And just to follow up, to what extent is it becoming critical for businesses in the region to showcase their sustainability credentials to attract talent?
Well, I just think it does. I think the younger population really understands these challenges and wants to see that their companies are integrative, that their companies are focused on diversity, their companies are responding as they should to the challenges at hand. I think it doesn't feel good to work to be part of sort of the old economy. I mean, everyone wants to be part of something that's new and modern. And I do think that building sustainability into your business model is new and modern. And that's certainly where youth want to be. But Marc probably has a broader perspective than I do.
No, I mean, I agree with that. And I guess I would like to pick up the differentiation that you put in, Lisa, earlier between the urban and maybe the rural side of the talent market. In the urban space, maybe sometimes it's a little bit more of an abstract conversation. It's more, the conversation around climate impacts going forward. And, maybe, yes, sometimes, some populations obviously see it sort of coming through when, they're affected by major weather disasters. But in general, it's maybe one more removed conversation. But if you think about sort of the workers that we talked about, the smallholder farmers, the workers that are working on the mines, that are working in the factories, if a company takes a holistic ESG approach, a lot of also the S part as well as the E part actually improves their livelihoods, right? Because it improves the way they live in the community, it improves maybe access to healthcare, improves safety on the job, so all of these things that directly translate into a better, outcome in terms of livelihoods. So for people. So I do think, if companies perform highly on ESG, both for the, I guess, I would call the more urban part of the population as well as rural, it is a differentiating factor, and I think can attract people because it's essential. It's not a nice to have necessarily, right?
Thank you. The economies of Southeast Asia are dominated by large conglomerates and state-owned enterprises. And so I would be interested to hear your views on how those type of businesses approach sustainability.
Happy to start off. I mean, I think in general, all companies have a role to play here, right? So everybody is addressed by the call for action. I think if I look at the fabric of, again, as we said earlier, across Southeast Asia, actually it looks quite different. Different type of companies sort of dominate also by sector. But what I think is for me encouraging here is, the two, I guess, sort of parts of the economy that you just mentioned, which is the more family-owned conglomerates and also the state-owned sector, which have a large portion of the economy often. One of the two things I would observe across both of these is they can take and they take typically a more longer-term perspective on business development, on development of their business, right? Because either that's obviously, given sort of from a government perspective, or, in the family conglomerates, it's more like a multi-generational viewpoint of building a business. So I think that's encouraging here because people can take a longer-term perspective on what it takes rather than a sort of shorter-term, year-by-year sort of driven financial results perspective, right? So if I would just contrast them maybe to the extreme. And then the other one is obviously, I think both of these sectors have a sort of not just a long-term perspective, but have an ability to kind of pull through and be more directive in terms of driving the business. And so if those long-term objectives are aligned with sustainability goals and climate action, then you also see things happening more quickly because of that ability to kind of drive through change more effectively. So, but it obviously takes both of those dimensions to be sort of in tandem, I guess, to actually drive to the outcomes that we were talking about throughout the last half hour.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Family conglomerates, I think, understand that this is the future. They're always looking for, as Marc says, that sort of long-term opportunity. And if they see a country headed in this direction, they're feeling in their sort of supply chains the push for transition. I do think that that's the sort of the direction that they will head. This is increasingly evident, I think, in Indonesia. I spoke at Kadin, which is the Chamber of Commerce last week, and I was really surprised to hear all of the very detailed conversation around sustainability in their own businesses. So these were families talking about sustainability in their businesses, and it was great to hear. MNCs, of course, have traditionally been the sort of the buyers of all the commodities in Southeast Asia, and they need to step up to encourage that transition by providing long-term offtake agreements for sustainable product and paying a higher price for that sustainable product. And that isn't happening now. They're still squeezing the producers in terms of price, and that is a challenge in terms of making, helping incentivize the transition. There's still resistance to jumping into support. There are a lot of pilot projects out there with communities, but and a lot of weeding out of perceived bad actors. But as Marc has said so rightly, we can't just weed out bad actors. We need to actually help lead this transition. So you can't eliminate a whole sector or a series of mills because they're not producing the right way. We need to help them transition because there are, thousands of jobs behind each one of these smaller Indonesian companies. Part of that is, again, we've spoken about the government, the role the government can play alongside the MNCs and the conglomerates, the need for agricultural extension services, again, maybe promoted by government, nurseries for planting materials, technology. Urban development is continuing apace. So what's happening in the sort of rural economies? And then again, the other piece of the question is like, what is the role of DFIs, the development finance institutions, which really should be taking the risk in this context and helping to lead this transition. And I think that they're also somewhat risk adverse. They are hammered by, entities or media outlets that monitor every project that they get invested in. So of course they're reluctant to step in and invest in difficult areas. They need to have local officers to understand that risk and to understand that, real risk, I guess, that, again, go back to that sort of misperception of risk. And then not compete with the private sector for those easy projects because there's money for those easy projects. It's, where is the difficulty? That's where sort of DFIs need to be playing a role with guarantees or first losses or FX facilities. I think that's all absolutely, they can play a really important role, but again, their balance sheet is quite small. So it comes back to the private sector really leading this, but certainly there is a role for DFIs to play in incentivizing this transition.
Thank you. And to conclude our exchange, do you expect sustainability considerations to take a backseat in the face of the economic challenges gathering around the region?
Let me take a stab at that one. So I've actually been asked this before, and particularly by corporates who are trying to understand how that whole landscape will move going forward. My personal take across the board on this is, talking to many clients as well, is of course they will potentially look at certain investments and when to take those investments because you need to obviously have a financial viable business. But I think the direction is clear. The speed will probably continue at this speed, and I think we will see an acceleration again. But maybe, if you compare 2 years ago to 1 year ago to now, we've seen a considerable acceleration. So question is, will we accelerate at the same speed or maybe go a little bit slower and then accelerate again, right? So, but I think it's more sort of the pace, finding the right pace, but I don't think it's any stop or any change in direction.
Yeah, I mean, I feel a lot of optimism actually in Southeast Asia about the future. A lot of, obviously, a large sort of youthful population, which has seen great transition already in their lifetime, in the urban sector, anyways. That just hasn't reached the sort of the rural parts of Indonesia, and I think that there's a sense of the need to transition to modernize the rural economies at the same pace, and the sense of possibility and hope and sustainability as a part of all of that. I think the Southeast Asian economies are very connected to climate. I mean, they are subject to typhoons and weather and droughts and floods, and more than perhaps others. So there is an urgency. There is an urgency which is felt by everybody, an urgency, and at the same time, this sort of sense of optimism in terms of the future, which is great to feel.
Thank you so much. And this concludes our discussion today. Marc, Lisa, thank you so much for sharing your views on sustainable businesses in Southeast Asia.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast. To stay up to date on events we may be hosting, emerging market news, and to build your personal network, please feel free to join the INSEAD Alumni Emerging Markets Interest Group on LinkedIn. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast. To stay up to date on events we may be hosting, emerging market news, and to build your personal network, please feel free to join the INSEAD Alumni Emerging Markets Interest Group on LinkedIn.